blood. The royal banquet turned into a slaughterhouse in 1 second. Necks snapped like dry twigs under Abbasid blades, while the prince watched his own brother's head roll into the river mud. One survivor against an entire empire. No crown, no army, only a cold thirst for revenge and a 3,000-mile race through hell. He isn't just running for his life, he is coming to steal a continent. They called him a ghost, but the desert was about to spit out a monster. You won't believe the price he paid to turn a massacre into a masterpiece. One man is about to rewrite history with a blade of fire, and it all started with a single scream in the dark. The silver chalice hit the marble floor with a dull thud, not with a splash of wine, but with the heavy spray of Abbasid steel cutting through Omeyyad throats. One night, one feast, one betrayal. The great hall in Damascus, once the heart of the world, had become a slaughterhouse. Abdulrahman, grandson of Caliph Hisham, watched from the shadows of the high balcony as his kin were butchered by men wearing black robes, the color of the new, bloodthirsty Caliphate. The scent of roasted lamb was replaced by the metallic tang of fresh slaughter. There was no time for mourning. The 20-year-old prince felt the cold draft of the secret passage behind him. He didn't run. He vanished. Behind him, the screams of the dying Omeyyads echoed against the stone walls, marking the end of an era that had lasted for 90 years. He moved like a ghost through the labyrinthine streets of Damascus. Every shadow was a soldier, every window an eye. The Abbasids had issued a decree. No male of the Omeyyad line was to draw breath by dawn. Abdulrahman reached the outskirts of the city, his lungs burning, his royal silks replaced by the coarse wool of a commoner. He met his 13-year-old brother, Yahya, at a prearranged spot by the river. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the frantic beat of their hearts. The plan was simple: reach the Euphrates, cross into the desert, and disappear. But the Abbasid hunters were not men who failed. They were professional killers, and they were already on the scent. The sound of galloping hooves shattered the silence of the riverbank. 10 riders, their black banners fluttering like wings of carrion birds, appeared on the ridge. "Into the water!" Abdulrahman hissed, grabbing Yahya's arm. The brothers plunged into the icy current of the Euphrates. The water was a chaotic swirl of grey and blue, pulling at their limbs. Behind them, the soldiers reached the bank. They didn't jump. They laughed. One of them shouted, "Come back, little princes! The Caliph offers mercy. Come back, and you shall be given gold and safety." It was a lie as old as time, a trap laid with honeyed words to save the soldiers a swim. Yahya, exhausted and terrified, faltered. The boy's strength was failing against the current. He looked back at the shore, at the outstretched hands of the men in black. "They promise peace, brother," he gasped, his eyes wide with a child's hope. Abdulrahman screamed, "No, keep swimming. It is death." But the boy turned back. Abdulrahman watched, frozen in the mid-river current, as Yahya struggled back to the muddy bank. The soldiers helped him up, their faces hidden behind iron masks. For 1 second, there was silence. Then, without a word, a soldier stepped forward and swung a heavy blade. The boy's head rolled into the mud before his body even hit the ground. A roar of pure, agonizing fury erupted from Abdulrahman's throat, but it was swallowed by the roar of the river. He had no time for tears. The archers were already notching arrows. Thrum! An arrow hissed past his ear. Thrum! Another pierced the water inches from his chest. He dived deep, the cold stinging his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He swam until his muscles screamed for oxygen, until the surface felt like a distant dream. When he finally broke the water on the far bank, the hunters were small dots in the distance. He was alone. The last scion of the sun was now a fugitive in the shadows of his own empire. He didn't stop to look back. He ran until the river was a memory and the desert became his only companion. The Abbasid Caliphate covered millions of square miles, and every inch of it was now a trap. Abdulrahman knew that, to survive, he had to become someone else. He had to shed the prince and become the predator. He moved toward the southwest, toward Africa, toward the ancestral lands of his mother's Berber tribe. Every caravan he passed was a risk. Every well he drank from could be poisoned with betrayal. He slept with a dagger in his hand, and the image of his brother's death burned into his retinas. Days turned into weeks. The heat of the Syrian desert gave way to the rugged hills of Palestine. He walked 40 miles a day, hiding in caves and eating dry dates. He learned to read the wind and the behavior of the birds to avoid patrols. The Abbasids had put a price of 1,000 gold pieces on his head, a fortune that could turn even a saint into a traitor. In a small village near the coast, he narrowly escaped a group of soldiers by hiding in a pile of salt in a merchant's warehouse. The burning salt stung his skin, a physical reminder of the price of his survival. By the time he reached the borders of Egypt, the prince was gone. In his place stood a man with eyes of flint and a heart of iron. He had crossed 1,000 miles of hostile territory, outsmarted the finest spies of Baghdad, and survived the grief that would have broken a lesser man. But Egypt was only the beginning. The real danger lay further west, in the lawless lands of Ifriqiya, where the governors were as treacherous as the shifting sands. Abdulrahman looked toward the setting sun. He was a man without a country, but he was still a king in his soul. The world thought the Omeyyads were dead. He was about to prove them wrong. The scorching sun of the Maghreb did not care for royal blood. It beat down on Abdulrahman as he crossed the border into Ifriqiya, a land where the authority of the distant Abbasid Caliph was nothing more than a whisper. Yet the blades of local governors were very real. He was no longer the pampered prince of Damascus. His skin was bronzed by the desert wind, and his hands were calloused from the hilt of a hidden blade. With him was Bedr, his most loyal servant, a man who had survived the slaughter and now served as his shadow. They moved between the tents of the Bedouins, blending with the nomadic tribes that drifted across the vast North African plains. But the reach of the new caliphate was long, and the reward for the head of an Omeyyad was enough to buy a kingdom. Abdurrahman ibn Habib, the governor of Ifriqiya, was a man of cold ambition. He knew that harboring a fugitive prince was a death sentence, but delivering one was a ticket to eternal favor in Baghdad. He deployed 500 elite cavalrymen to scour the coast and the desert fringes. The hunt was relentless. In the middle of a moonless night, the sound of thundering hooves shattered the silence of a small Berber encampment where Abdulrahman lay sleeping. Bedr shook him awake just as the first tents were being overturned. "They are here," Bedr hissed, thrusting a spear into his master's hand. They didn't have 5 minutes, they had seconds. They fled into the darkness of the dunes, the shouts of the soldiers echoing behind them. The governor's men were systematic, using torches to light up the desert like a sea of fire. Abdulrahman and Bedr crawled through the scrub, their bellies to the sand, while the riders passed 10 yards away. The prince watched as the soldiers interrogated the tribesmen, threatening to burn their livestock if the Damascus refugee wasn't found. This was the point of no return. Abdulrahman realized that as long as he stayed in the cities or the known oases, he was a dead man. He needed the protection of the great Berber tribes, specifically the Nafsa, his mother's people. The journey toward the Nafsa territory in the far west was a 1,500-mile gauntlet of betrayal. In one village, a local chieftain offered them bread and salt, only for Bedr to overhear him sending a messenger to the nearest garrison. They fled before the meal was served, stealing 2 swift horses and riding until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. The heat reached 45 degrees C during the day, and the nights were a bone-chilling contrast. Abdulrahman's boots wore through, leaving him to walk on feet wrapped in blood-soaked rags. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black banners of the Abbasids. Every time he woke, he felt the weight of the 1,000 gold piece bounty hanging over his neck. A breakthrough came when they reached the camp of the Zenata tribe. Here, the name of his mother, a Berber princess, carried weight. The tribal elders saw not a fugitive, but a symbol of defiance against the Arab governors who taxed them heavily. They gave him a fresh horse and a guard of 20 warriors. For the first time in 5 years, Abdulrahman felt a glimmer of hope. But the danger was not over. Ibn Habib's spies were everywhere. While resting at a hidden well, a group of assassins disguised as merchants attacked. The struggle was short and brutal. Abdulrahman killed 2 men with his own hands, his blade moving with the desperation of a cornered lion. He was no longer just surviving. He was fighting back. As they reached the Atlantic coast, the landscape changed from yellow sand to rugged cliffs. The air turned salty, and the sound of the waves replaced the whistle of the desert wind. From the heights of Ceuta, Abdulrahman looked across the narrow strait. On a clear day, he could see the misty mountains of al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula. He knew that territory was a chaotic mess of warring factions. The governor there, Yusuf al-Fihri, was a man who played both sides, officially supporting the Abbasids but ruling as a king. To stay in Africa was to be a hunted animal. To cross the sea was to enter a furnace of civil war. Abdulrahman turned to Bedr, his eyes reflecting the cold blue of the Mediterranean. "The governors here seek my head to please a master in Baghdad," he said, his voice raspy from the salt air. "In al-Andalus, the tribes seek a master of their own. If I must die, I will die with a crown on my head, not a rope around my neck." He sent Bedr across the water with a secret message for the Omeyyad loyalists, the Syrian and Yemenite troops stationed in Spain who were weary of al-Fihri's tyranny. He told them that the Falcon of the Quraysh was ready to lead. He waited on the African shore for months, living in a simple hut, watching the horizon every morning. He was 25 years old, a man who had lost a world and was now trying to build a new one from nothing but whispers and old loyalties. Finally, a small boat appeared, battling the currents of the strait. Bedr jumped onto the sand before the boat even touched the shore. He wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 representatives of the great Arab clans of al-Andalus. They didn't bring gold. They brought a promise of 4,000 swords and the keys to a kingdom. The time of hiding was over. The time of conquest had begun. The air in the secret meeting chamber in Ceuta was thick with the scent of salt and conspiracy. Bedr sat across from the 3 envoys of the Andalusian clans, men with hard faces and hands scarred by 20 years of frontier warfare. They were representatives of the Yemenite tribes and the Syrian loyalists, groups that had been marginalized by the iron-fisted rule of Yusuf al-Fihri. Outside, the waves of the Mediterranean crashed against the rocks, a constant reminder of the 9-mile gap between exile and an empire. "The prince is young," one of the envoys, Abu Ghalib, whispered, his eyes narrowing. "Does he have the stomach for the steel of al-Andalus, or is he merely a ghost of Damascus?" Bedr didn't answer with words. He drew a heavy ring from his robe, the seal of the Omeyyads, and pressed it into the wax of a flickering candle. "He has survived the slaughter of his entire bloodline and 3,000 miles of desert. He does not seek a throne for comfort. He seeks it for justice." The envoys looked at the seal and then at each other. They knew that al-Andalus was a powder keg. Yusuf al-Fihri had allied himself with the Abbasids to keep his grip on power, but his taxes were high and his favor was limited to his own kin. The 15,000 Syrian soldiers stationed in the south were hungry for a leader of royal blood, and the Yemenite tribes were ready to burn the governor's palaces to the ground. While Bedr negotiated, Abdulrahman remained hidden in the rugged Rif Mountains. He spent his days studying maps of the Iberian Peninsula, memorizing the mountain passes of the Sierra Nevada and the fortifications of Cordoba. He knew that if he crossed the sea, there would be no retreat. He was playing a game of 3D chess where the stakes were his life and the future of his dynasty. He received reports that al-Fihri had mobilized 1,000 cavalrymen to patrol the southern coast of Spain. The governor had heard rumors of a Falcon circling his borders, and he had ordered that any stranger caught on the beaches of Elvira or Malaga be executed without trial. The conspiracy deepened when a secret courier arrived from Seville. The message was from the leaders of the Umayyad clients, the Mawali. They promised that if Abdulrahman landed, they would seize the city's gates and provide 5,000 horses. But there was a catch. The Yemenite tribes demanded that the prince promise them land and administrative power in the new government. It was a dangerous bargain. To accept was to risk the wrath of the Syrian clans. To refuse was to lose the very army he needed to win. Abdulrahman sent back a single line: "I do not come as a tribal chieftain, but as a caliph's grandson. I bring order to all and favoritism to none." It was a gamble on his own charisma. Back in al-Andalus, Yusuf al-Fihri was not idle. He tried to bribe the conspirators with 1,000 silver dirhams each to deliver the Syrian pretender in chains. The tension in the cities of the south reached a breaking point. In the marketplaces of Granada and Almeria, men spoke in hushed tones about the return of the white banner. Riots broke out in the barracks of the Syrian regiments. The Abbasid agents in the region grew nervous, sending urgent letters to Baghdad warning that the Omeyyad infection was spreading. The geopolitical balance of the entire Mediterranean was shifting toward a single man waiting on a beach in Africa. The final meeting took place in a hidden cove near Tangier. The envoys returned to Abdulrahman with a definitive answer. "The swords are ready, but the winds are treacherous," Abu Ghalib warned. "If you land now, you land in the middle of a civil war. Al-Fihri is marching south to crush the Yemenites. If you wait, the momentum will die." Abdulrahman looked at the small fishing vessel that would take him across. It was a fragile wooden boat, barely large enough for 10 men. It seemed an impossible chariot for the restoration of a world power. But he saw the fire in the eyes of his supporters. The night of the departure was 14th August 755. A storm was brewing in the west, turning the sky a bruised purple. Abdulrahman stepped onto the boat, followed by Bedr and a small guard of 11 warriors. He carried nothing but his grandfather's sword and a bag of dates. As the sails caught the wind, he felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. He was no longer a refugee. He was an invader. Behind him lay the ruins of his past. Before him, the uncertainty of a continent he had never seen. The journey across the strait took 12 hours of grueling rowing against a fierce current. As the sun began to rise, the white cliffs of al-Munyekah appeared through the mist. The beach was not empty. Hundreds of horsemen were gathered on the sand, their spears glinting in the first light of dawn. For a moment, Abdulrahman feared a trap. He gripped the hilt of his sword, ready to die on the shoreline. But as the boat grounded in the shallows, the riders did not charge. They dismounted and knelt in the surf. A thunderous cry rose from 1,000 throats. "Long live the Emir! Long live the Falcon!" Abdulrahman stepped onto the soil of Europe, the first Omeyyad to do so as a master. The hunt was over. The war had begun. The keel of the boat grated against the pebbles of al-Munyekah, a sound that signaled the end of a 5-year exile and the start of a bloody reconquest. As Abdulrahman stepped onto the Spanish sand, the 1,000 horsemen waiting for him erupted into a roar of Allahu Akbar. They were the Syrian veterans, men who had served his grandfather and refused to bow to the Abbasid black banners. But the air was heavy with more than just loyalty. It smelled of salt, horse sweat, and impending slaughter. Within 2 hours of his landing, scouts arrived with news that sent a chill through the celebratory crowd. Yusuf al-Fihri's vanguard, 2,000 seasoned Berber cavalry, was already galloping south from Cordoba to intercept the Syrian plague before it could take root. The prince did not wait to build a palace. He built a war machine. He immediately ordered the burning of any boat that could be used for retreat, a signal to his men that there was only victory or the grave. By the second day, his small force had doubled to 2,000 as local Yemenite tribesmen poured from the hills of the Alpujarras, bringing with them 500 fresh horses and rusted but sharp lances. Abdulrahman moved with a kinetic energy that stunned his followers. He spent 18 hours a day in the saddle, reviewing troops, settling tribal blood feuds with a single word, and organizing a logistics train of 100 pack mules. He wasn't just a claimant. He was a general who understood that speed was his only shield against the sheer numbers of the governor. The first clash occurred near the banks of the Guadalfeo River. Al-Fihri's vanguard attempted a surprise night raid, hoping to catch the Falcon in his tent. But Abdulrahman had anticipated the move. He had left his campfires burning and moved his main force into the surrounding olive groves. When the governor's cavalry charged into the empty camp, the darkness exploded with the hiss of 500 Omeyyad arrows. The ambush was a massacre. 300 of the governor's men fell in the first 10 minutes, and the rest fled in a chaotic retreat toward Malaga. This small victory acted like a magnet. By the time Abdulrahman reached the gates of Archidona, his army had swelled to 5,000 battle-hardened warriors. However, the political landscape was shifting as fast as the front lines. Yusuf al-Fihri, realizing he could not win by force alone, sent an embassy offering a 50-year truce and a mountain of gold if Abdulrahman would return to Africa. It was a point of reconnection for the story's tension. Many of the Yemenite sheikhiv, tired of decades of war, began to whisper about accepting the gold. Abdulrahman saw the wavering in their eyes. He stood before his commanders and drew his sword, pointing it toward the north. "I did not cross the sea for silver," he thundered. "I came for the house of my fathers. If you want the governor's gold, go to him. If you want a future, follow me." The dissent vanished, replaced by a fierce, singular focus. The march north became a race against time. Al-Fihri was gathering a massive host of 12,000 men in the plains of Cordoba, calling upon every clan that feared the return of the Omeyyads. Abdulrahman's scouts reported that the governor had also hired 1,000 Christian mercenaries from the north, men who fought with heavy mail and longswords. To counter this, Abdulrahman utilized the fire and movement tactics of the desert, keeping his light cavalry in constant motion to harass the governor's supply lines. He captured 3 key fortresses in 10 days, securing the high ground and ensuring his army wouldn't be trapped in the valleys. As they approached the city of Seville, the tension reached a fever pitch. Seville was the gateway to the heart of al-Andalus, and its walls were formidable. The city's garrison was loyal to al-Fihri, but the people were divided. Abdulrahman didn't launch a frontal assault. He sent 50 agents into the city to spread word of his arrival. He promised a 20% reduction in taxes and full protection for all faiths. On the night of the 3rd day of the siege, a group of citizens overpowered the guards at the eastern gate. The gates swung open, and the white banner of the Omeyyads entered the city under the light of 1,000 torches. The occupation of Seville was a masterstroke. It gave Abdulrahman a base of operations, 1,000 silver coins from the treasury, and, most importantly, the legitimacy of a ruler. But the triumph was short-lived. A messenger arrived, his horse foaming at the mouth, with dire news. Yusuf al-Fihri had crossed the Guadalquivir with his full army and was marching to retake Seville. He was only 15 miles away. The scale of the threat was now 3 times larger than anything Abdulrahman had faced. The prince stood on the ramparts of Seville, looking at the dust clouds on the horizon. He turned to Bedr and ordered the mobilization of every man capable of holding a spear. "We will not wait for him behind these walls," Abdulrahman said, his voice cold and steady. "A wall is just a cage. We meet him in the open field, where the spirit of Damascus will decide the fate of this land." The 4th part of his journey ended not with a celebration, but with the sharpening of 5,000 swords. The decisive moment was no longer a dream. It was a reality waiting on the plains of Musara. The atmosphere in Seville was electric, a mixture of fanatical devotion and the cold dread of an approaching storm. Abdulrahman rode through the city's narrow streets on a white stallion, his presence turning the ancient Roman foundations into a theater of war. The people showered him with flower petals, but he only had eyes for the steel of his ranks. He had 7,000 men now, a patchwork army of Syrian loyalists, Yemenite tribesmen, and newly recruited Seville citizens. Yet, across the banks of the Guadalquivir, Yusuf al-Fihri was assembling a juggernaut of 14,000 soldiers. The governor had realized that this Falcon was not a mere raider. He was a kingmaker, and he had to be crushed before the spring rains ended. The tension escalated when al-Fihri attempted a final desperate act of sabotage. He sent 10 assassins, disguised as defecting Syrian officers, into Abdulrahman's inner circle. Their mission was to slide a dagger between the prince's ribs during the evening prayer. Bedr, ever the watchful shadow, noticed a slight tremble in the hand of one officer as he reached for his cloak. Before the steel could be drawn, Bedr's blade had already tasted blood. The failed assassination attempt backfired spectacularly. It fueled a religious fervor among Abdulrahman's troops, who now viewed him as divinely protected. The prince didn't execute the remaining conspirators immediately. He paraded them through the camp as a living testament to the governor's cowardice. Dynamic maneuvers began as the two armies moved toward each other along the river. Abdulrahman knew he could not win a head-on collision against double his numbers. He used the terrain of the Al-Jarafe hills, moving his troops in 3 columns to hide his true strength. He feigned a retreat toward the south, drawing al-Fihri's heavy cavalry into the marshy wetlands where their horses found no purchase. Every mile was a calculated risk. On the night of 13th of May 756, the two hosts finally stood eye to eye on the plains of Musara, just outside the walls of Cordoba. The campfires of the governor's army stretched for 2 miles, a sea of flickering lights that threatened to swallow the small Omeyyad camp. The psychological warfare reached its peak at dawn. Al-Fihri, confident in his numerical superiority, sent a herald to offer Abdulrahman one last chance. "Leave now, and your men shall have safe passage to the sea. Stay, and the crows of al-Andalus will feast on royal flesh." Abdulrahman didn't send a herald back. He stood on a hill in full view of both armies, took a spear from a soldier, and snapped it over his knee. It was a clear message. There would be no truce, no surrender, and no middle ground. The Yemenite sheikhi, once hesitant, were galvanized by this display of raw defiance. They knew they were fighting for a man who had burned his bridges and his boats. A sudden crisis nearly derailed the momentum. A rumor spread through the Yemenite ranks that Abdulrahman was planning to flee back to Africa if the first charge failed. Panic began to ripple through the left flank. Seeing the formation buckle, Abdulrahman did the unthinkable. He dismounted his horse and ordered his generals to do the same. "I will fight on foot in the front rank, like the humblest of you," he shouted. "If I fall, step over my body and take the city." This act of radical solidarity turned a potential rout into a wall of iron. The men shifted their grip on their shields, their eyes locking onto the governor's lines with a new, terrifying hunger. As the morning mist began to lift, the sound of 1,000 drums began to beat, a rhythmic, deafening pulse that signaled the start of the end. Al-Fihri's archers stepped forward, their bows creaking under the strain. Abdulrahman raised his hand, waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that the first 15 minutes of the battle would decide the next 300 years. He wasn't just looking at the enemy. He was looking at the white walls of Cordoba in the distance, the capital that had been his grandfather's dream and was now his only destiny. The point of reconnection for the troops came when a group of 500 elite Berber horsemen from al-Fihri's side suddenly broke rank and galloped toward Abdulrahman. For a heartbeat, the Omeyyad line braced for impact. But instead of lowering their lances, the Berbers dipped their banners and shouted their allegiance to the prince. The betrayal shattered al-Fihri's confidence. The governor screamed orders, but the chaos had already begun. Abdulrahman saw the opening. He didn't wait for his horse. He drew his sword and led the charge on foot, a white-clad figure rushing into the center of the storm. The air was filled with the screams of men and the clatter of 1,000 blades. The Battle of Musara was no longer a tactical exercise. It was a meat grinder. Abdulrahman pushed through the center, his guard clearing a path through the governor's mercenaries. He was no longer the fugitive who hid in salt piles or the refugee who crossed the Euphrates. He was the Falcon in mid-strike. As the sun reached its zenith, the Omeyyad banner broke through the final line of defense. The path to Seville was now a path to the throne, and the walls of Cordoba were finally within his reach. The air at Musara turned into a swirling vortex of steel and dust. 15 May, 756. The heat was a physical weight, but Abdulrahman moved through the chaos like a storm. He was in the thick of the meat grinder, his white tunic splattered with the crimson of the men who stood between him and his destiny. Yusuf al-Fihri's center began to groan under the sheer pressure of the Omeyyad charge. The governor's elite guard, 1,000 men in heavy mail, tried to wall off the prince, but the Yemenite infantry, fueled by years of resentment, crashed into them like a tidal wave. Abdulrahman's sword was a blur. He wasn't just fighting for a throne, he was fighting for every Omeyyad soul left unavenged in the dirt of Damascus. The point of reconnection came when Yusuf al-Fihri, seeing his lines crumble, attempted a desperate countercharge with his remaining 500 cavalry. They aimed straight for Abdulrahman's white banner. The earth shook as the horses thundered forward. For a moment it looked as if the Falcon would be crushed under a mountain of iron. But Abdulrahman's archers, hidden in the tall grass of the riverbank, let fly a volley of 2,000 arrows. The governor's horses tripped and somersaulted, turning the charge into a pile of broken limbs and screaming men. Seeing their leader falter, the rest of al-Fihri's army broke. 12,000 men turned and fled toward the gates of Cordoba, casting away their shields to run faster. The pursuit was relentless. Abdulrahman did not give them time to breathe or regroup behind the city walls. He reached the gates of Cordoba just as the sun began to dip, painting the Guadalquivir in shades of fire. The city was in a panic. Yusuf al-Fihri escaped through a northern postern, fleeing toward the mountains, leaving his palace and his family behind. The citizens, seeing the inevitable, threw open the great gate. Abdulrahman did not enter as a butcher. He entered as a restorer. He forbade his soldiers from looting, placing a 100 gold piece fine on any man who touched a civilian's property. This act of mercy secured the city more effectively than any siege. That evening, the prince stood on the balcony of the Alcazar, the governor's palace. Below him, thousands of people gathered in the central plaza, their faces lit by the glow of victory fires. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that the 3,000-mile journey was finally over. He was 26 years old. 6 years ago, he was a ghost in the desert. Tonight, he was the master of al-Andalus. He ordered the white banner to be raised over the highest tower, replacing the black flags of the Abbasids. The world had shifted on its axis. On Friday, during the noon prayer at the great mosque, the preacher climbed the pulpit. For the first time in 6 years, the name of the Abbasid Caliph was omitted. Instead, the voice rang out, "Long live the Emir, Abdulrahman ibn Muawiyah, the independent sovereign of al-Andalus." The crowd erupted. This was the formal declaration of a new state, a direct challenge to the power of Baghdad. He had severed the western limb of the Caliphate and transformed it into a heart of its own. He would no longer be a vassal. He was the founder of a dynasty that would rule for 275 years. But the work was just beginning. Within 24 hours of his coronation, Abdulrahman ordered the construction of new fortifications and the reorganization of the tax system. He knew the Abbasids would send an army to reclaim their lost province. He didn't wait for them. He began building the foundations of what would become the most advanced civilization in medieval Europe. He planted the first palm tree in the gardens of Cordoba, a seedling brought from Syria, a living bridge between his lost home and his new empire. One palm tree, one man, one vision. The story of the Falcon of the Quraysh became a legend that reached even the ears of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur in Baghdad. When told of Abdulrahman's success, the Caliph admitted with bitter respect, "He crossed the sea, entered a land of lions, and built an empire from nothing but his own wit and steel. Truly, he is the Falcon." The prince had turned the crimson banquet of his youth into a feast of civilization that would last until 1031. He had survived the sword to become the pen that wrote the history of the West. The final scene was one of quiet triumph. Abdulrahman sat in his garden as the moon rose over the mosque. The sounds of the city, the call to prayer, the clatter of the markets, the laughter of children swirled around him. He had lost his family, his home, and his youth to the desert, but he had gained a world. He closed his eyes, hearing the ghost of his brother Yahya's laughter in the wind. The debt was paid. The dynasty was born. Al-Andalus was his, and it would never be the same again.